Hi, chat. How are you guys doing today? I'd like to introduce everybody to the very first Rule the Waves 3 ship design contest. I got to say that I'm really blown away by the level of community interaction we've gotten with this. We got a massive number of submissions. You guys really did a fantastic job sending us in ship designs. Really good response. With me today, down right below me, as you can see him here, is Das Tactic. Das, you probably know him if you've ever needed a tutorial on a Matrix title. He's probably made a video on it. Das, you wanna tell the people about what you do?
Yeah, thanks, Liam. I've been, of course, streaming for a long time now, and very honoured to actually be in such illustrious company with this particular judging. It's funny actually because when I knew that Drac was actually on, I thought, oh, okay, I better not get too involved in the technical and mainly go for the artistic. So that's sort of more the bent that I've taken with this particular run at everything.
And then over, let's see, nope, wrong direction. There we go. Is Drakenifel. Drac, you want to tell the people, the few people probably in chat that don't know who you are, what you do with your YouTube channel?
I do naval history on YouTube, and now expanding into other forms of naval history. Got Portsmouth Dockyard tour coming up, and getting my first book published next year. So all branches of naval history represented here, unless it's after 1950, in which case I'm not that interested.
And we were supposed to have a third judge, Brother Monroe, but I'm afraid to tell the audience that he has had to drop out. He's feeling under the weather, and so we'd like to, wish Brother Monroe, speedy recovery. Your health takes priority, so we wish he was here, but health takes priority. I'm glad that he's decided to recover, and we need our 6 winners though, and so we've only got 2 judges here. So I'll be filling in. And before anybody goes, oh, marketing guy picking ships, that ain't right. I've been playing Rule the Wave since the second game when you had to send in a mail order, and it wasn't on Steam yet, when you had to ask for an email, like a code over email. So I'm familiar with the game. I'm by no means an expert, but I'm a fan too. So don't worry. I've done my due diligence. And I think with Drakenifil and Das Tactic here, we're all in good company for picking out some really solid designs here. So with that being said, I think we can go forward and start showing off our designs. So category 1, if you guys read the contest rules, was for 1920s dreadnoughts. We got a lot of battlecruiser submissions as well, and so we decided best to include them. People wanted to show off some battlecruiser designs they've done, and it let the fans show off what they want to show off, I think. So let me just chuck that first one up on screen. And this was from Das Tactics choice for category 1. So Das, you want to tell us about why you picked this particular design for your winner for category 1?
Yeah, so what I really liked about this one actually was well, first of all, my approach, as I said, because I knew that Drac was actually going to be in the judging panel. I thought I better really focus very heavily on the descriptions and the artistic. So I did weigh them quite heavily. So if a ship design actually had design choices that were listed in their description, I would actually weigh that way above something that was just a historical summary of what was going on. So I did look for I guess design considerations and sort of how the ship was, what the thinking behind the ship actually was. And so in this case, we've got what does it say there? So happy to participate. Not a very good English speaker, so I didn't care at all about that side of things. There was more to this, wasn't there? Or was that pretty much it? Yeah, because it does sort of say with a speed of 34 knots, it escapes from battleships and overruns cruisers. But the next war has already begun. Can the ship that survived World War One hold out against until Scheifelen is completed? And so in this sort of case, because it was built for Germany in that sort of era, and one thing I've sort of found when I play the game is that I personally err on the side of speed, simply so I can escape. I tend to pick and choose which battles I go into, and so I sort of thought that because that was really what the central crux of this sexual ship was to essentially be a raider, essentially a very very fast ship. That was really the aspect that I sort of embraced. So for me, it was I was interested in it. Can you scroll down to the actual guns? Sorry, I don't actually have that open on my other screen. So yeah, there we go. So we've got only 12-inch guns, but it does give them a little bit of extra quality in through there. So for me, this was something that would pick and choose its battles. 34 knot speed, I thought was exceptional. The armor is lightish, I guess, in around the actual ship itself, but if it's a hit and run type ship, I wouldn't expect this one to be duking it out with other large ships. So for me, this is something that would sort of be the bully of the schoolyard type ship. So I quite liked that was the thinking of the actual ship itself. So that was why I rated it so highly.
Yeah, I gotta say with that speed, I don't think there's anything that could catch this that could actually kill it. So long as you're not pressing it into the line of battle, yeah, I think this can pick its fights very carefully and do a great job.
Yeah, I this one
Yeah,
rated fairly highly, although it wasn't my winner. I've got to say this one was quite high on my list as well, because it's essentially a 1920 reinvention of the original Invincible type. You know, it's a fast cruiser killer, and it does that job very well. It's never going to win a fight against contemporary battle cruisers, but contemporary battle cruisers by the 1920 period had essentially become slightly different flavors of battleship. Most of them were just fast battleships by other names. So kind of reverting back to type the same way we actually see later on with the Alaskas and the B-64s in World War II. There's a certain logic to what they're trying to do there.
So, moving on from that one, we have Drax winner for Category 1, which is the Ewald von Kleist, also known as Jackie Fisher's Redemption. So, Jack, you want to tell us about this design?
Yeah, so this was my final pick, and as we were discussing in the pre-stream meetup, my final choices were very difficult. I got down to about 5. Then I had to start going after very, very nitpicky details because I was aiming for essentially was does the design reflect some of the design concepts that were going around in the 1920s, and does it sort of work with them to bring out what could potentially have been the best in those concepts? So there were a few designs that were very solid, perfectly serviceable ships, but ultimately, when you looked at them, they were slightly improved or modified versions of ships that already existed at the time. So I finally had, as I say, about 5 that were good interpretations, but didn't have really any precedent. And then once I'd eliminated a couple of them for very, very minor flaws, but flaws nonetheless compared to the other 3, I was then left with 3. And after I think about half an hour of just going back and forth, I ended up picking HMS Pursuer. Now, the reason for this is, one, it's an all-forward design. So that's something you see with the Nelsons historically around this time period. And those of you out there who've watched my channel will know I'm a bit of a sucker for the all-forward design. I really like it. But in 1920, it makes a huge, huge amount of sense in terms of shortening up your citadel to allow you to get more protection. And I mean, that's the reason it was picked for the what would become the Nelson class. So by picking that, it's, he showed the designer showing a really good grasp of what would have been the most effective and most efficient way of designing something in 1920. And then when you look at the balance of armament versus armor versus speed, okay, it's not the fastest of the designs that were sent in, but it's battleship level firepower. We've got 8 15-inch guns. Okay, in 1920, people are designing some 16-inch ships, but still 8 15-inch guns all up forward is still quite heavy punches. Talking about the same kind of punch as Queen Elizabeth, Revenge, Hood, etc., etc. Obviously, in this case, it can bring them all to bear in the forward arc. You've got 13.5 inches of belt armor inclined, so that actually gives it a surprisingly heavy degree of protection, especially at long range. And the way this ship is set up, with good deck armor as well, it definitely seems to be designed to fight at long range, but also it's heavy enough to close in and duke it out. And whilst, as I said, it's not a battle cruiser, it's not pushing 30 knots the way that, or more, the way that 1920 battle cruiser designs were. It's still markedly faster than basically anything you're going to find in the regular battle line. And so, yeah, it's just a really good all-round design. There's nothing really wrong with it. It's got the speed, it's got the protection, it's got the firepower. There were, as I said, one or two designs that were maybe slightly better in one or the other of those three categories, but I felt that this was probably the most well-rounded. And if it had been constructed, in this case, obviously it's a British ship, but to be honest, anyone who constructed a ship like this would have had a very, very powerful unit on their hands. In many ways, it was kind of almost a quadruple turret crossover variant of O3 and F3, which were the two competing designs for what would become the Nelson class, with O3, the battleship variant, winning. F3, the battle cruiser they didn't build, is actually somewhat similar to this, but just a little bit quicker and with triple turrets instead. So yeah, it's just although the description is obviously a little bit tongue-in-cheek with Fisher's Redemption, it's actually just a genuinely good ship.
Can I ask a question, Drac, about the forward-facing guns? Was that how prevalent were they in that era?
So in the 1920s era, you only got the Nelson class. HMS Nelson and Rodney were constructed with them. Essentially, the concept had grown out of the British previous designs, which were actually considerably larger, the N3 and G3 battleship and battlecruiser pairing, although they didn't go completely all up front. But that was essentially down to the British trying to figure out how can we get lots of firepower and lots of armor and a decent speed, but also have ships that are, I hate to say small enough, considering you're talking about designs well over 45,000 tons, but they're not so outlandishly large that they can still fit within our existing dry docks. And by going all forward, it meant that you could shorten the ship's citadel, and if you could shorten the ship's citadel, you could save weight and therefore reduce the size of the ship for a given amount of speed, protection, and firepower. Now, the interesting thing is, although only they were the 1920s design ships, they were the only ones with all forward guns, you then had the Dunkirks and Richelieus for the French that were built in the 1930s that also had this layout for essentially the same reasons. And sometimes people say the all-forward armament was a dead end because they just point to the fact that relatively few all-forward ships were built. But actually, when you look through the design histories of ships we're very familiar with, especially from World War II, like Yamato, the American USS North Carolina, their fast battleships, the County-class cruisers, etc., an awful lot of them actually had all-forward designs working through their iterations of design right up until almost the very end, where for various rather specific reasons, they ended up going with a more conventional turrets forward and turret aft layout. but an awful lot of navies during the interwar period looked at the Nelsons, realized some of the advantages inherent, and almost managed to build more of them. So it's essentially
Was that a British thing? Like, was that something that, like, for example, could the smaller navies? Is that something the smaller navies would shy away from, or is it something because Britain had the largest navy at that stage? Is that something that they could, I guess, afford to do, or does it give them extra advantage?
it gives them advantages. I mean, there's no real reason not to do it in the 20s once you've realized what the advantages of it are. The only real restrictions on why you wouldn't do it is essentially a somewhat blind aft fire arc, and obviously with all your armament up forward, theoretically, if something catastrophic goes wrong, you could be out all your main battery. Although I would tend to argue that if something so catastrophic happens to one of your main turrets that the others are knocked out, you've probably also split the ship in half, regardless of how many turrets there are fore or aft. But there are one or two design compromises, and I think the two things that really forced people away from or guided them away in the 1930s was, for the Americans, they had infrastructure, they had big dry docks, they didn't have to worry about what the British were having to worry about of, can we get this length of ship in our existing dry docks, at which point they could afford to be a little bit more extravagant and have a larger citadel that weighed more and have that aft fire arc. But the other thing was also the advent of aircraft, because although a normal forward design gives you the possibility for an absolutely fantastic anti-aircraft nest from your superstructure aft, as well, you can kind of see from the layout of the secondaries with this thing, there's a very long portion of your ship that you can't put secondary guns on because of the blast effects of your forward turrets, which can render the forward arc of your ship somewhat vulnerable to incoming air attack. Now, obviously, if you've got a fleet and you've got escorts and you've got ships in a battle line, you have a degree of mutual support and cover, but it means a ship individually does have some weakness to air attack. And as the 1930s progressed and that became more and more of a concern, having the more conventional layout where the superstructures are midships gives you a lot of midship space to put a secondary battery, and an anti-aircraft battery for that matter. So, it's kind of a swings and roundabouts. You could, in theory, with an all-forward design, just turn slightly away from the incoming air attack, which you probably want to do anyway if they're dropping torpedoes at you, and give them an absolute faceful from your aft AA battery. But that may not necessarily sometimes be in your interest, like if you're trying to hold a battle line formation. If enemy aircraft can force you to turn simply by existing in the vicinity, it's one of these multiple tactical choices of, there are half a dozen different possible scenarios. Which ones do you think are most likely for your Navy and which ones are the most important for your Navy? Make your decision based on that. But every Navy is different in that respect. So, yeah, I mean, if there had been a much larger export market for warships the way there was in the 1900s, if there had been that same large export market in the 20s and 30s, the main reason there wasn't was basically the naval treaties. But if that market had been there, I suspect an awful lot of smaller countries would have gone with all forward designs. Because apart from anything, if you're not interested in building the biggest, meanest ship on the block, it also allows you to build a ship that's okay but fairly cheap.
Yep. Interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah, thank you, Trek. I have to say, I do tend to, when I play these games, I do tend to also go for all forward designs. It just makes sense if you're pursuing a decisive battle doctrine. It's a very economical decision to make. The one problem is just those quad turrets have a bit of a teething period to them, but once you get the tech for it, it makes a heck of a lot of sense.
Yeah. Well,
so
most of my playthroughs have a similar.
So this is from Use of the Black Baron, and this is what I selected for my Category 1 winner with the Otechsetsveni Ogon. I'll just call it Homeland's Fire and not butcher the pronunciation. This is a Soviet design that he said he got from the British. So he had this constructed in a British yard. I don't know if in 1920 the Soviets would be able to IRL swing the British constructing them a dreadnought, but let's say the Brits are maybe cash strapped and somehow the Soviets have a bit of cash lying around and maybe they'd like an injection into their economy. What I adored about this design was he said specifically it's for firepower. This is trying to cram a heck of a lot of guns onto a ship. And it seems to be built with Russia in mind, with the naval geography of Russia, and it really shows here. 38,000 tons, so not pretty substantial size. 26 knots, which is a respectable speed. But the engine priority has been set to speed, and the accommodations are set to cramped. Which to me reads this thing's hanging around in like the Black Sea maybe, and the North Sea, or the Baltic Sea around Leningrad, and that's about it. That's where she's hanging out, defending the entrances to Russia's main naval ports. And when he said that this design was built for firepower, it really shows. He has 9 14-inch guns in 4 separate turrets. He has 8 10-inch guns in casemates, which is an interesting decision to make for a 1920 design. And then he's got 24 4-inch guns in single mounts spread all over the ship. And you'll see in the graphic, he's put a lot of these 4-inch guns on top of the main armament. And so these poor 4-inch gunners are having to ride around on top of these 14-inch gun turrets, which I'm sure they adore that every time those guns fire. I'm sure they're having a great time. And I just I adore the character that this thing has, and also still has 2 submerged torpedo tubes because why not? It's 1920. Maybe I'm not exactly sure when they stopped doing that for battleships. 1920 feels a bit late, but this also feels like a Soviet design from the 1920s. It's not quite all there because this is a new government that doesn't quite have the naval experience or resources to really put down the most optimal design. I almost feel like he built this at a British yard, but I feel like this would almost be like a half-finished Tsarist battleship that the Soviets would finish off with their own modifications to try and modernize it and cover it with as many guns as possible to make it work. That's what it reads to me. This does feel like the battleship of a new revolutionary regime that hasn't quite settled down on a doctrine or design decisions and has made a bit of a messy ship. And that's kind of the description of it too, is all firepower without compromising speed. Leans heavily into the 4-inch guns to defend against planes and would-be destroyers, and squeezing every bit into performance by limiting accommodations and limiting engine reliability. So to me, it's on the one hand, it's a bit of a messy ship, but it's also fit for purpose, which is defending Russian ports and not really projecting power. If she does try to project power, those cramped crew accommodations, that engine priority is going to really, really hurt them badly. But, again, for such an eclectic, a bit of a messy ship, it's very fit for purpose.
How many guns are actually in that bottom section there between those 2 turrets? Is that guns all the way around on the?
That's guns down there. That's 2, 4,
Wow.
6, 8, 9. I'm counting 9 there. 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 21, 22, 23, 24. Okay, I think they're all accounted for actually on the graphic. Yes, they're all there, all spread about. And then
that's just awesome, isn't it?
Well, again, too, that's part of the silliness of the design too. Is 10-inch guns
Yep.
and casemates, 8 of them all spread about the ship. That's
Yeah.
again, that seems like a bit of an afterthought. Like they had the design ready to go, and then they decided to modify it and add a bit more. I mean, this isn't quite enough. We need some more. And so I think
this is very much a ship built by a nation who's decided that having a degree in naval architecture is a bourgeoisie concept and you will be sent to Gulag. And then whoever's left in the design office has just been told, well, guess what? You get to design a ship now, or you get sent to Gulag as well.
Did anyone ever put guns on top of guns like that?
Well, funnily enough, actually, there were quite a few cases of guns mounted on top of turrets. If you look at some early pictures of HMS Dreadnought, some of her 12-pounders are mounted almost exactly like the forward turret here. It was 2 mounts sitting on the turret roof. And then later on in World War II, and even on some of the surviving museum ships, you see light anti-aircraft guns, usually both as 40 mils, stuck on the turret roofs as well. The key thing, though, to remember about those is that with Dreadnought, they weren't expecting to use the main battery if they engaged torpedo boats. And likewise, if you are in World War II, if you're using your 20 mils and your 40 mils, you're being attacked by aircraft. Again, you're not expecting to use your main battery. So this one, I mean, it's got the 4-inch guns on there. In theory, if it's engaging aircraft and destroyers and so forth, it makes a certain amount of sense. But yeah, like you said, I wouldn't want to be on some of those. I mean, most of them you can probably just leave if a big ship shows up over the horizon. You can get to shelter. But I suspect I'd be very, very nervous if I was one of the 2 gun crews on that forward turret with the triple sitting right over my head.
They would have been trained differently too, wouldn't they? They wouldn't even be able to use the main turret crew to man the smaller guns, or would they?
Well, I mean, there's a certain degree of crossover, but the crew sizes and the way you load a main battleship gun is somewhat different. But when you're loading a main battleship gun, you're essentially supervising a set of very heavy, depending on your nation, electrical, hydraulic, pneumatic equipment, because apart from maybe some of the charge bags, you're physically incapable of handling the most of the stuff that's being involved. You're not going to pick up a shell that weighs a ton. But with the whole thing's happening very deliberately over the course of about half a minute to a minute. Whereas with a 4-inch gun, you're more interested in slinging as many shells downrange as humanly possible, and almost everything on those guns is going to be completely manual. So they're going to be pick up the shell, physically carry the shell, physically slam the shell in. I really doubt any of those are going to be power operation for the loading. Then someone's going to have to physically close the breach, lock it all up, and then get out of the way so it can fire.
Yeah, you do get autoloaders for 4-inch guns later in the game, but not at this point. At this point, it's just a 19-year-old with some strong arms that's doing most of the work. So that's category 1 covered. And so we're on to category 2 now, which is everything from 1890 to 1920. Battleships, battle cruisers, dreadnoughts, ironclads, the works was open for this category. And we had some very, I guess I would call them esoteric submissions, definitely. Some very interesting interwar design, or experimental designs, I guess you could call them. But the first one up is from user Gabino, and this was Das's pick for this ship. Das, another battle cruiser, so I can tell, speed definitely matters for you. This one was the Reina Victoria Eugenia.
Reading the what was written for it, like basically 1913 Vickers designed for Spain to counter the larger French or Italian navies. So for me, that was even just that little statement there meant an awful lot about the what you could actually do with the ship and what they wanted to, what this ship was designed to do. Like it was. If it was, I'm guessing in one sense it's going in the Mediterranean, but I don't think I thought about that much when I was actually looking at it, because we don't actually have, the accommodation is just normal, isn't it, in through there? So it's not even it's not even a Mediterranean class ship. So I had just assumed that it was basically, like, if it was Spain, it was to be. I was thinking it was going to be more, again, to be roaming through the Atlantic and just looking after their overseas air territory. So again, a bit of a loner type ship. And when I'm thinking of a ship that's got to sort of operate pretty much on its own, then speed for me becomes a fairly major priority, and that hit and run aspect, and sort of being able to pick and choose your fight. So similar to the other design, having a look at the other comments that there, essentially just it's going through what the derivative is. So if you just scroll back up the top there a little bit, just with the description, just might as well read it all out. So I've got it on here. I can read it out. So reduced funds, a smaller Lion Congo derivative, similar armament and armor, less range and speed, basically. But it's still at 25 knots. It's still a very, very uh, formidable ship. So the 13 and a half guns to outrange enemy ships. Again, that would be to only outgun or outrange smaller ships, I would imagine. So again, more of a raider type ship. 25 knot speed to act as raiders, force or decline combat, and gain tactical advantage in battle. So I think at that point, then I sort of thought, well, this is actually for overseas. So I'm not sure why the Italian navies were sort of mentioned there, but I could certainly sort of understand it if it was for the French, but again, not sort of operating within the in the Mediterranean itself. So for me, I just sort of, again, I like the design given those design constraints. So, and I did actually weigh very heavily with my choices based on what the descriptions actually were. So in this case, the ship was designed for a very specific purpose, and I thought that it was a tick all the way around. It could run away from fights that it really couldn't compete with, and it could sort of raid where it needed to. For me, it was a good choice all the way through. Had no tertiary guns. When we have a look at the actual armaments, 13-inch guns. I mean, that's pretty big for that era. The quality is sort of like zero, so you're not really getting any negatives in through that aspect of it. That also was a factor for me. A fair number of guns, a fair number of large guns on the ship as well. So you could actually get some lucky shots in amongst those particular hits. And then you've got like a lot of 5-inch guns as well. So that's which would then sort of, and again, like a lot of those encasemates all the way through. But those would then be like not the biggest of those sort of guns, but enough to cause a lot of damage. Quite often, those sort of smaller guns end up being the deciding factor, isn't it? Really, in the battles when you actually are playing Rule the Waves 3. So, if you are getting close enough to use your 5-inch guns, you're at least going to make a fairly big impact in that aspect. They did actually have torpedoes on it as well, which again, I mean, we've spoken a bit about torpedoes on these larger ships, and I didn't really worry too much about whether they had torpedoes or not. But again, I'm thinking if it's a raider operating on its own, then the torpedoes could be there to finish off ships that they may need to. There's not too many of them, just basically one on either side, port and starboard. Other than that, though, I actually really quite liked it was fit for purpose. The armor. If we could have a look across at the armor again, like it's sort of it's like the deck is lightish. I guess at 2.5. But other than that, I still thought it was fairly well rounded with the way that the armor was. A bit light, if anything, but it's still. I don't know. For me, it's sort of from when I was just evaluating it, I thought, yep, that it ticks the design constraints that was placed on it.
Yeah, I have to say with that belt armor too, for battle cruiser, that seems quite high actually for a 1913 battle cruiser. And that makes me think if it has to actually brawl with a cruiser at some point and take some, say, some 6-inch rounds, she can roll with the punches for that one. This isn't. I don't think it's quite like invincible levels of armor. It's a lot higher than that. And then 8 13-inch guns on a battle cruiser for this period is quite respectable. That's a pretty good armament. If she's meant to go abroad, it's hard to get long range with coal and turbine. When you have coal, it's very difficult to really get that long range going. You need oil for that. But if this thing can recoal at like friendly stations, absolutely, I can see this running around the world and doing some serious damage and making it difficult to pin down. Really, I think this.
Spain had the Canaries at that stage, didn't they? That was part of this.
Yeah. I mean, this looks to me it's very much a hybrid of Congo and Tiger, and considering that the two are so similar already that historically people often get confused as to which one preceded which. Is the Tiger a British Congo or is the Congo a Japanese Tiger? And this is kind of like the baby edition, the hybrid. It's just that little bit smaller, a little bit lower. But yeah, 9 inches of belt armor. That's the same as Lion, Queen Mary, Princess Royal, Tiger. That's actually a little bit, it's an inch thicker than the Congos. And the interesting thing is that at Jutland, albeit that you had Queen Mary detonate, that wasn't to do with her belt armor, and Tiger and Lion in that battle and Princess Royal actually both all proved that 9 inches of belt armor was just enough to stand up to contemporary 11 and 12-inch gunfire. And when you look at the time this thing's being designed, 12-inch guns are all you're going to face from the Italians and the French, and you've got the speed to just leave if you don't like fighting their capital ships. So yeah, I mean, I liked this design as well. I think this was in my top 6 designs before I whittled them down in this category. Yeah, it's a good one, especially for someone, as you said, who's put a lot of design constraints on themselves by building for a nation that by this point is nowhere near the top tier of naval powers, and historically, with the Hispania class made some, should we say, interesting choices in warship design because of the budgets.
All right, and for category 2, we also have a Drax submission now from username Dinah. And this one has a real story to it. This one has a narrative to it. We put a limit of 300 characters on submissions, but let's be honest. If someone wants to write a story, we're gonna read it. And this one, I don't know if we want to go over the whole thing, but Drac, it's yours, your pick. So can you tell us a little about it?
Yeah, so this is a theoretical Chinese battleship. I mean, it's obviously designed on a completely off-kilter timeline because as somehow Imperial China has either not encountered or has somehow undone the absolutely catastrophic mismanagement it was undergoing in the late 19th century that would lead to a series of civil wars, and then obviously eventually the prolonged Chinese civil war that led to the takeover of the communists after World War II. But with that said, despite the fact it's on this completely alternate timeline, its design history is entirely in keeping with the utter madness of both 1900s to 1910s ship design generally, and particularly the historical lunacy of the Chinese Navy. So if anyone's familiar with the Battle of the Yalu River, which they fought against the Japanese at the end of the 19th century, so about a decade or two before this thing was constructed, one of the problems that their navy had was that a lot of the admirals they put in charge were still thinking in a very, not just a medieval mindset, but specifically a Chinese medieval mindset. So they had huge amounts of money being thrown at them to modernize the Chinese Navy. And one of the admirals decided that one of the best ways to spend truly stupid amounts of money was to build a marble battleship. And I'm not talking about a marble battleship in terms of like a ship made of stone. At sea, it was literally a gigantic statue of a battleship with the money he was supposed to spend on making an actual battleship. But his idea was literally straight out of the medieval period of, if we build big stone battleship in our harbor, then our enemies, when they come to the harbor in peacetime, will see it and they will be very impressed and very terrified that our nation has all the money and the power to build this gigantic vanity statue, and then they won't attack us. And it turns out the Japanese turned around and went, great, they've wasted half their naval budget on a monument, so they don't have any actual navy, let's go after them, which was probably the opposite effect that he intended. But when you look at this, it's like whoever that guy was, Chinese name is, I'm not going to try pronouncing it, but like this thing, I thought, yeah, his son built this thing because it's so close to being a dreadnought. It's it's got 11-inch guns fore and aft. It's got this kind of hexagonal pattern to its guns. Historically, the Germans obviously would do this with the Nassau class, albeit they had 2 twin turrets on either side instead of 3, in 11-inch, and that was their first dreadnought. And this thing's just kind of gone, well, we're going to have 10-inch guns, and we're going to add in an extra pair of twin turrets, and it's this perfect blend of almost and yet so far, because a single inch in caliber on those guns, and you'd have actually an inefficiently laid out but surprisingly powerful early dreadnought. But this being Imperial China circa the 1900s, they've completely got and messed it up. And of course, they've got gun quality -1 on both, which is also, I mean, whoever designed this clearly has an eye for history, because that was another one of the problems there. They didn't train their gunners very much. There are rumors, albeit the sources disagree somewhat, on whether or not some of the shells in the Chinese Navy at that point have been replaced by shells filled with concrete and sawdust because someone had stolen the explosives to sell to make money. And they're simultaneously buying things but also not making the wisest choices. So the idea that they've gone and got somebody's second-hand cast off 11 and 10-inch guns, you can just imagine them sending people around the world, and someone's come back and go, well, I've got this really good deal from Germany for some 11-inch guns, and then another court official shows, well, yeah, but I've got this other really good deal from the British for 10-inch guns, and then because of court politics, they're going, well, we're going to fit both of them on our ship. But with all that said, speed-wise, for a technically a pre-dreadnought, it's solid. Belt armor is surprisingly good. In all the other respects, it's actually a fairly durable design, just with this absolutely lunatic main and secondary battery split, and I absolutely love it. It's there were my top three were essentially ships that people had sent in that not only were actually vaguely functional, but had completely embraced the kind of 3 steps forward and then 1 step sideways with a backflip that represents so many ship designs of this era.
Yeah, she still has the submerged torpedo tubes, which is very appropriate for a pre-dreadnought. Technically built at a French yard, so some Chinese court official had to go to the French and commission this design, and the French built it. And with the narrative that the Dinah here submitted was that it finally sank in a suicide attack on the British fleet, and he says it took down. Where is it? Yes, the British sent 32 battleships, and the Chinese had 9 at their to fight them off. And sank 11 British battleships before finally getting.
I don't Chinese think carries enough ammunition for that, but
I think the Chinese fleet did.
Yeah, I'm assuming in this scenario. I assumed when I read that scenario that for whatever reason, I'm guessing the British are sending their kind of older pre-dreadnoughts like the Majestics and the Royal Sovereigns, and this is kind of an almost dreadnought. But to be perfectly honest, it's their background; they can write it how they like. But even when I was looking at that, it's kind of like, the idea of the Chinese fleet going, well, this is going very badly. Our choices are run away or Leroy Jenkins, and half the fleet doing one and half the fleet doing the other, is actually, again, spot on for Chinese conduct in the Sino-Japanese War. So, yeah.
She's certainly got the main and secondary battery to shoot in all directions, to sail straight into the British line and just start firing in every direction.
Yeah, it'd take a while to disable all of her main guns.
And with that one, we come to the final winner, submitted by student Wang. I guess I hadn't noticed this until I picked it, was that both my designs were Russian, but this one's Imperial Russian. And the narrative here is that it's a built in French dockyards, which the Russians did a lot. The Battle of Tsushima was basically English ships versus French ships, but crewed by the Russians and the Japanese. And here we have the Zarevich or Cesarevich class battleship. Heavy secondary battery, and the lore reason behind it is reduce the reliance on cruisers, so the ship can protect itself against small threats. state of the art for the time, 1900. I really like the graphics work that was done here. I really like the design of the body of the ship, how kind of chubby it is, I guess you could say, and the way he's drawn up the citadel and the deck and the gun placements. I think that looks really, really good. Narrow belt, so definitely trying to save some weight on the belt. Armor scheme, pretty good. The belt's a little on the light side, but he said too that this is there's a big emphasis on firepower here, and you can see that she's got 13-inch guns, which for a pre-dreadnought is substantial. Those are some pretty beefy guns for a pre-dread. And then also that secondary armament, 12 8-inch guns and 16 4-inch. That is substantial. Torpedo boats as intended. This ship could operate. I think if it was attacked by destroyers or cruisers, she's definitely got the secondary armament to keep herself safe. 2 torpedo tubes, which is again pretty standard for a pre-dreadnought battleship. No anti-aircraft guns yet. Doesn't need them. And I don't know if this thing's going to really be able to last much beyond. I think this thing has a shelf life of about 20 years, and then you're probably going to want to get rid of it. So I don't think you have to worry too much about that. Definitely the armor is the flakiest part of this ship. The deck's pretty good. You don't have to worry about plunging fire just yet, but that belt is definitely something to be concerned about, although that upper belt is ridiculously thick for what an upper belt is usually meant to do. And the belt extended is also quite durable. Conning tower and turrets are okay, nothing exceptional, but they should be able to work for a while. I was just really drawn, especially to the idea of trying to minimize the need of like support ships, less destroyers, less cruisers, by putting all those secondaries on your standard or on your pre-dreadnoughts. Definitely the kind of economizing that I think you'd probably see theoreticians trying to come up with in the period. And I kind of kept on harping on it. I really like the aesthetics of this design. I think that kind of fat wide design is something you'd see with these pre-dreadnoughts. And I appreciate the sort of the sprite work that the user put into this one. I thought it was good work, very good work.
Yeah, it's one of those things which again this was another one in my selection that was high up and kind of almost made the final cut. It shows a very good appreciation of historical design work, because 9 inches of belt armor, as you say, it's a little light, but it is historically represented in pre-dreadnoughts of that period. 13-inch guns, also the US Indiana class carried them, for example, around this time period. The speed is just a fraction on the high side, but entirely doable. There were some pre-dreadnoughts that reached this speed. And the secondary armament as well. I mean, that is kind of the one thing that's a little bit out left field compared to Russian pre-dreadnought design of the time period, but it has a perfect historical precedent, because when you look at some of the American pre-dreadnoughts, there's a series of American pre-dreadnoughts that do have twin 8-inch guns as secondaries, and in actual fact, despite having quite a substantial 8-inch battery, this is laid out slightly less madly than the historical designs. You look up the Virginia pre-dreadnoughts if you fancy a horror show, because they decided the best way to mount some of their 8-inch guns was not just to put them on top of the main battery turrets, but they didn't even, for some obvious reasons, end up putting a turret on a turret. They literally just put a fixed gun house on a turret. So you had a double stack turret fore and aft, where the lower part had 12-inch guns and the upper part had 8-inch guns. And, well, you just had to hope that you were wanting to shoot at the same target, because you had no way of trading the 8-inch guns in any other direction other than where the main armament pointed. So, in that respect, this implementation.
Why would they do
is
that?
actually
what's the thinking behind doing something like that?
The thinking was back in that period, the pre-dreadnoughts were still stuck on the idea that with relatively few main guns, and perhaps the main guns not firing very often, they were thinking that the secondary battery would be what would be used to actually overwhelm an enemy ship with a hail of incoming fire, and you'd use the main guns to essentially finish it off. If you got a few lucky hits, great, but mainly your main guns would be used at close range to get those waterline shots that kill the ship whilst you incapacitate it with your other guns. So in that respect, I suppose, yeah, you're pointing the guns at the same at a battleship, great, but it does mean with the American design that if you want to engage an armored cruiser, you still have to point your main battery that way, regardless of if you want to use it.
He doesn't have that many rounds per gun, does he, for the main armament there? So that would sort of, I guess, make sense where you're not actually just slugging it out at long range. That would be a short range.
I was also thinking radically different than 1900 compared to 1905.
I was also thinking too, those 13-inch guns are not going to have a very fast fire rate, so those 81 rounds might actually last you for quite a while. Whereas those 8-inch guns have 120 rounds, which I think will keep you solidly supplied through the fight. Definitely a little on the light side for ammo, but I think firepower wise, this is a very respectable loadout that this ship has.
Yeah, there's kind of a split in this time period. It starts in round about 1900, and by the time you get to 1905, it's definitely emerged. There's a split in thinking amongst pre-dreadnoughts where some of them have kept with kind of the 5 to 6 inch gun caliber on the theory they can have more secondary guns with a higher rate of fire, and other nations have gone with progressively larger and larger secondary guns with slower rates of fire, but on the theory that armor thickness and technology is advancing such that they want to be able to punch through at least some of the armor of enemy battleships. So when you see the last German pre-dreadnoughts, the Deutschlands, they've still got 5.9 inch guns, whereas the last British pre-dreadnoughts, the Lord Nelsons, have 9.2 inch guns for their secondaries. So, as I said, this is a good design, definitely. One of several really good ones that were submitted.
And as you say, Liam, the actual artwork is like the actual work putting to actually build the ship looks exceptional.
Yeah, I definitely like that sort of rounded, kind of a little wide design. It definitely fits into that early 1900s kind of battleship aesthetic of sort of bulging out at the center. And with that, those are our 6 winners. And I think we have about 5 minutes left, not too much time left. So I want to quickly, just rushing through this, go through some honorable mentions that we had. Let me just pull these up. So unfortunately, these guys weren't quite the cut for the winners, but they were very good submissions nonetheless, and I think they're worth pointing out. Das, this was one you ranked quite highly, was Dimitri's submission of he had 6,000 tons left in a treaty limitation, and so he built a 6,000-ton pre-Dreadnought battleship, which is an interesting design.
Yeah, again, it was one of these things where I love the look of it. Again, if we, I don't know if we can zoom in on the actual graphic there, but the graphic looked great. For me, it was a lot of the aesthetics of this one, and I don't have my notes for what I actually had written for this one here, but I did actually really I like the story, like the graphics. I think this was extremely close to winning for me. Like, this was my second choice, I think. So it was one of those things. It was probably a bit undergunned, but it was with just that one twin turret. But I wasn't like a lot of it. I really wasn't worried too much about those aspects. If the design constraints in the text sort of matched with what was being done, and it did. So for me, it was I like the effort that had been put into it. Like a lot of secondary guns as well. So. I did like this one a lot.
Drax honorable mention, and I will say I think we had 2 battle carrier submissions, but his here we have a battle carrier.
Yes, this as I said, for the category 2, I was a lot more willing to embrace the designs that had fully embraced the madness of the period, and for me, by a very narrow margin, this was the maddest of the mad that was somewhat plausible. I mean, the backstory to this thing is it starts off as a 12-inch gun battleship, and then somebody turns around. It's a French ship, and someone turns around and goes, "Yeah, no, we want an aircraft carrier, so we're going to convert this older ship and just relocate the main battery to the wings and put the world's narrowest tightrope of a flight deck down the middle, and we're now going to have the world's craziest battle carrier." And yes, it's an entirely insane, entirely implausible ship. And if someone had designed this in real life, they would probably be summarily executed for treason and wasting state resources. But it is a perfect encapsulation of some of the actual genuine early carrier designs turned right up to 11. I mean, you've got HMS Furious. Before she has a flush flight deck, she has a forward flight deck and an 18-inch single gun on the back. And Admiral Beatty, at one point when they were converting Eagle into a carrier, wanted to fit it with 18 triple torpedo launchers on the grounds that aircraft can't fly at night, so carriers are useless at night, but we'll stick God's own torpedo battery on it and send it up against cruiser squadrons. We'll never expect it. Well, there's one part of that sentence that is correct. So yeah, this is just like another flavor on let's be as mad as possible with aircraft carriers. And I've got to, hats off to the guy. It properly embraces that.
Yeah, I have to say there were two battle carrier designs. This is the one we had, but thank you for the battle carrier designs. I think they're absolutely a treat to go over. And that was from Charlie Fitt. And then the honorable mention I decided to pick out from Ryan Chang was the new battle line concept to rethink U.S. battleship design in the post-World War period. Which again seems like something that would actually be considered maybe when they're trying to cut down naval costs post-war is design a dreadnought where you only armor one side of the ship and focus all your armaments on that one side of the ship. 8 16-inch guns, which is like a lot. That's a lot of firepower for the period. I love the sprite work on it is hilarious. He assured me that it is in fact a legal design, and I haven't tried to replicate it yet in game. But even if it's not, I have to say that this is, again, something you could totally imagine someone drawing up in the 1920s, and maybe them never building it, but definitely entertaining the idea of trying to economize. We were talking about all forward armaments earlier and how that, helps economize on ship sizes and helps rationalize, armor placements and armament placements. And I could see them entertaining this idea for a ship anyway.
I think we all loved this one, didn't we? All of us had commented about it, so it was one of those things that was in the final selection for I think all three of us.
Yeah, he promises that it balances out the weight by having all the boilers on one side.
Yeah, I mean, US battleship designs of the 1910s through 1920s had some properly mad ideas. I mean, nothing quite this bad, but surprisingly close. Just look up the torpedo battleship or the reinvented. I think it's the new Ironsides or the new ironclad design. They're not a million miles away from this kind of off-the-wall concept.
Alrighty, so that was got to say that was a lot of fun. I'd like to thank you guys for joining in on this. We had a fantastic response from the community for this. Lots of submissions. I wish we could show them all, but there's a limited number of hours in the day. We had, again, a tremendous participation. Before we wrap it up, Das, Strack, anything you guys want to plug specifically for your channels in the upcoming weeks?
From my perspective, I'm actually doing a stream after this one here on Slytherins, actually, so I'll just plug that one. I'll probably need about 10-15 minutes just to sort of go and get a cup of coffee. I woke up and didn't get a cup of coffee before I started this one, so my apologies if I was a little bit tired, but I will just need a bit of time to do that one. So I'll be following up this one with a different game here on the channel.
And for me, I haven't got anything coming up for the rest of tonight, fortunately, just apart from dinner. But on Wednesday, I have finally, for those of you who've been with the channel for at least 3 years, there's been Admiral Nelson Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, which was a bit of a tease because it was the entire Trafalgar campaign except the battle. But finally, at long last, we're going to get the Battle of Trafalgar itself, and obviously the death of Nelson. That's coming out this Wednesday. Huge amount of work's gone into that for me, and there'll probably be a number of follow-up videos to come afterwards. But I think it makes a really nice capstone to the life of Nelson. Yeah, go watch that if you like. I mean, come on, it was Trafalgar Day over the weekend.
So we've got
actually, I'm really looking forward to that.
From...
It's yeah. Sorry, I was just going to say I'll definitely be wanting to watch that one because I do love your content. So that'll be great.
So we've got the whole timeline now from the polar bear as a midshipman and killing the polar bear to the Battle of the Nile, and now we're finally wrapping up with Trafalgar. It's a heck of a life that Nelson managed to live. So, in case you missed it, our winners were Gabino, Ho Tenki, Ewald von Kleist, Dinah, Student Wang, and the Black Baron. So, you 6 winners will all be getting a $30 voucher for the Matrix store sent to you, in addition to a $15 participation voucher. And everybody that sent in a valid design will also be getting a $15 voucher. We should be able to send those out to all of you by the end of the week. So just, a little patience. We have to write out a bunch of emails and send them all off. But if you don't get yours by the end of the week, you can contact customer support. And we should be able to rectify that. But we will be sending those all off. So expect that within a week. Again, another thanks to you guys. Thank you for participating. And we will hopefully maybe do something like this in the future. Who's to say? Maybe another one of these.
Sounds good.
Yeah, it's good fun. It was great fun.
All right. Take care, everybody.